Warning: this story contains extreme violence, slasher elements, and murder. I encourage you to listen to the entire story, and if you enjoy this type of content, please subscribe and press the bell icon to stay updated. I felt the carriage rumble beneath me as it ascended the winding path toward the castle. The moon hung ominously in the sky, half hidden behind clouds that threatened to obscure its pale, ghostly glow. My breath was heavy with anticipation, my heart beating to the rhythm of the horses' hooves clattering on the cobblestones. Tonight was the night of the grand ball at Castle Dracula. A night of elegance, masked seduction, and hidden dangers. The invitation had arrived mysteriously, as if it had been placed upon my bedside table while I slept. The black parchment, embossed with crimson wax bearing a crest I could not decipher, seemed to shimmer in the dim light of my chambers. Attend the midnight feast. It had read, a celebration of life and pleasure beyond the bounds of mortality. I knew it was reckless to accept such an invitation, but the allure of the unknown had always called to me. Something within me longed to walk the shadowed halls of the infamous castle, to see the Count himself. Legend spoke of his dark beauty, his insatiable hunger for both flesh and blood, and the opulent excess of his gatherings. The carriage slowed as we approached the castle gates. A heavy fog had settled over the grounds, rolling in like the breath of the dead. Two stone gargoyles loomed at the entrance, their leering faces seeming to follow me as I descended from the carriage. My heart pounded in my chest as the doors swung open. And I stepped inside. The grand ballroom was a spectacle of wealth and decadence, the chandelier above casting an eerie light across the faces of the guests. They were dressed in the finest silks and velvets, their eyes hidden behind intricate masks of gold and silver. A haunting melody drifted through the air, played by musicians in a corner of the room. The atmosphere was thick with an almost tangible sense of anticipation. A dark figure stood at the head of the room, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in it. He wore a deep crimson cloak that billowed as he moved, and his eyes glowed like embers beneath his mask. This, I knew, was the Count. His lips curled into a smile as he raised a goblet of wine, or what I assumed was wine, to his lips, his eyes locking onto mine. Welcome, honored guests. His voice was like velvet, smooth and dangerous. Tonight, we gather to indulge in the pleasures of the flesh and the ecstasy of the night. But know this, what you give, you will receive tenfold. His words hung in the air, heavy with hidden meaning. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, though it wasn't just fear that gripped me. It was something darker, something primal. The erotic tension in the room was palpable, and I could feel it seeping into my skin, awakening desires I had never known. The feast began with delicacies laid out across long tables draped in velvet, their surfaces groaning beneath the weight of exotic meats, fruits, and goblets of blood-red wine. As I sipped from my glass, I noticed how the wine tasted richer, thicker than anything I had ever consumed. It left a metallic tang on my tongue, but I did not stop. No one stopped. I mingled with the other guests, exchanging pleasantries, but all the while I felt the Count's eyes on me. There was a darkness in those eyes, something ancient and hungry, and it thrilled me in ways I could not explain. Every glance from him sent a shiver of anticipation through my body, making my skin tingle as though I were being watched by a predator. As the night wore on, the mood of the ball shifted. The music grew louder, more frantic. The guests, once poised and elegant, now danced with wild abandon, their laughter sharp and unnatural. Couples broke away from the main floor, disappearing into shadowed corners, their bodies moving with a desperate need. The room began to feel too warm, the air thick with lust and something far. I felt my pulse quicken, but my feet carried me closer to the Count. His gaze had never left me, and when I stood before him, his smile widened. "You've been waiting for this moment," he whispered, his voice like a caress. "But do you truly understand what you have walked into?" My throat was dry, and I couldn't find the words to respond. I only nodded, my breath shallow. His hand reached out, cold as the grave, and he gently traced the line of my jaw. His touch was electrifying, and I felt a pull within me, a need to submit, to give myself over completely. "Come," he said softly, leading me toward a grand staircase. "The true feast is about to begin." I followed him, my body trembling with anticipation and fear. As we ascended the stairs, I glanced back at the ballroom below. The guests had begun to tear away their masks, revealing faces contorted with desire and madness. Some had fangs, glistening with fresh blood, while others had claws, their fingers curling like talons. This was no ordinary gathering. This was a slaughterhouse disguised as a ball. We reached the top of the stairs, and the Count led me into a chamber lit by flickering candlelight. The room was draped in red, the walls adorned with portraits of men and women whose eyes seemed to follow me with every step. In the center of the room was a large, intricately carved wooden chair, no, a throne. Bloodstains marred its surface. "Dark and old, sit," the Count commanded, his voice leaving no room for disobedience. I obeyed, my heart racing as I took my place in the throne. He stood before me, his eyes gleaming with hunger. Slowly, he removed his cloak, revealing a body that was both beautiful and terrifying. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his muscles were lean and defined. He was every bit the predator the legends claimed him to be. "You will be my final guest of honor," he said, his voice low and dangerous. And before I could respond, his fangs flashed in the candlelight, and he was upon me. His mouth found the soft skin of my neck, and I felt the sharp, exquisite pain as his teeth sank deep into my flesh. I gasped, the pain mixing with a strange, overwhelming pleasure that coursed through my veins. My vision blurred, and my body went limp beneath him, unable to resist. I could feel the life draining from me, my blood filling his mouth as he drank deeply. But I was not afraid. No, this was ecstasy, an ecstasy that I had never known, an ecstasy that I could not deny. I had become a part of the midnight feast. The night wore on, and when the dawn finally came, there were no survivors among the guests. The ballroom was silent, save for the echoes of the horrific feast that had taken place. The Count stood victorious, his thirst for blood and pleasure sated, for now. As I drifted between the borders of life and death, the cold embrace of the Count's bite slowly fading, my vision returned in blurred fragments. The chamber was no longer filled with the ethereal beauty that had once entranced me. Instead, it had transformed into a vision of pure, undiluted horror. The walls that once gleamed with gold and velvet now appeared as rotting flesh, pulsating with the grotesque stench of decay. Blood dripped from the ceiling, pooling on the floor beneath me, thick and coagulated. The once elegant guests, now unrecognizable, lay sprawled across the floor, their limbs twisted in grotesque shapes, skin pale and bloated as if they had been dead for days, weeks, even months. But worse than the sight of their mangled bodies were their eyes, wide open, hollow, and empty, staring at nothing but holding the faint echo of the terror they had experienced in their final moments. I tried to move, but my body was leaden, my veins still thrumming with the remnants of the Count's bite. I could feel the heat of his venom still coursing through me, infecting not just my blood. And then, the sharp realization hit me like a blade. This was only the beginning. The Count stood before me, his face twisted into a smile that was both seductive and terrifying. His mouth was smeared with fresh blood, the deep red contrasting starkly with his pale skin. He was not sated. I could feel it in the air, a hunger that transcended the physical. It was an all-consuming need to dominate, to torment, to torture. "I see it in your eyes," he purred, his voice a seductive whisper that seemed to echo inside my skull. "You understand now, don't you? This is not just a feast of flesh and blood, it is the banquet of souls. Your suffering is my sustenance, he reached out and stroked my face. His touch cold and unyielding. I shuddered but could not pull away. My body refused to obey, paralyzed by both fear and the venom that coursed through my veins. His fingers trailed down to my throat, where the fresh puncture mark still throbbed, raw and aching. "You will join them soon enough," he whispered, his breath cold against my skin. "But not yet. First, you will know true agony." His words sent a wave of terror crashing through me. I wanted to scream, but the sound was trapped in my throat. My heart pounded violently as I realized what was about to happen. The night had only just begun, and I was his final entertainment, his final plaything. With a flick of his hand, the doors to the chamber burst open. And the room filled with figures cloaked in shadows. They moved silently, their faces obscured, but I could feel their presence, ancient, malevolent, and ravenous. They were his servants, bound to him in death and in undeath, their souls lost to the same fate that awaited me. The Count stepped back, allowing one of the figures to approach me. My pulse raced, my muscles screaming to flee, but my body remained motionless in the throne. The figure leaned over me, and I could see the hollow black pits where its eyes should have been. It opened its mouth wide, revealing rows of sharpened, rotten teeth, before plunging them deep into my arm. The pain was immediate and blinding. I felt my flesh tear beneath its bite, the skin ripping apart as the creature gnawed at me with ravenous hunger. Blood poured from the wound, spilling down my arm and soaking the once elegant fabric of my gown. My vision swam, but the pain kept me grounded in reality, forcing me to confront every second of my torment. I gasped, finally finding my voice, and let out a scream that echoed through the chamber. But my scream only seemed to excite the creatures, who descended upon me in droves. Another latched onto my leg, tearing into my thigh with brutal force, while yet another sunk its claws into my abdomen, peeling the flesh away in long, agonizing strips. I was being consumed alive. The Count watched with cold amusement, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction as I writhed in pain. He enjoyed this. My suffering was his pleasure. Every scream, every gasp, every moment of sheer agony fed his insatiable hunger. Through the haze of pain, I could feel my mind beginning to fracture. Reality bent and warped as the agony dragged on. Time became meaningless, each second stretching into an eternity of torment. My body was breaking, torn apart piece by piece, but the venom in my veins kept me alive, kept me feeling every excruciating moment of it. And still, I could not die. The creatures feasted on me for what felt like hours, their bites growing more savage with each passing moment. My vision flickered between darkness and light, but I could not escape the pain. It was unrelenting, brutal, and raw. When they finally pulled back, leaving my mutilated body slumped in the throne, I thought it was over. I thought the nightmare had reached its climax. The Count stepped forward once more, his smile wider now, almost feral. His eyes burned with an unnatural fire as he leaned down, placing his cold hands on either side of my ravaged face. "You are still alive," he whispered, almost in awe. "Your spirit is strong. That will make the next part all the more satisfying." He stood back, his arms raised toward the ceiling. The shadows in the room seemed to tremble at his command, coiling and writhing like living things. From the darkness emerged a massive, iron device, a rack, its metal teeth glinting in the candlelight. Chains hung from its sides, and its surface was stained with old blood. I tried to scream, to beg for mercy, but my voice was gone. The creatures dragged me from the throne and threw me onto the rack, my broken body lying limp against the cold metal. The chains rattled as they bound my wrists and ankles, pulling my limbs taut. The Count stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with sadistic delight. He placed his hands on the crank at the side of the rack, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he began to turn it. The agony that followed was beyond anything I had ever known. My body was already destroyed, but now it was being stretched, pulled to the breaking point. My bones creaked and groaned under the pressure, my skin tearing further as the tension increased. Every joint, every muscle screamed in protest, but I could do nothing. I was trapped in the purest, most torturous agony imaginable. The Count watched, his eyes never leaving mine. He was feeding off my pain, drawing power from my suffering. And I knew then that this was his true feast, not the blood, not the flesh, but the agony of his victims. This was what sustained him. I could feel my sanity slipping away, the edges of my mind unraveling under the weight of the torment. My vision blurred, and the world began to fade into darkness. But even as I hovered on the edge of unconsciousness, the Count's "Do not think death will come for you so easily," he whispered, his voice a dark caress. "I will not let you go until I have taken everything from you." With one final twist of the crank, I felt my body give way. My limbs were wrenched from their sockets, my spine snapping with a sickening crack. And then, mercifully, the darkness finally claimed me. When I awoke, I was no longer in the chamber. I was lying on a cold, stone floor, my body whole once more. The pain was gone, replaced by an eerie numbness that chilled me to my core. I looked around, disoriented, and found myself in a dungeon, the walls damp and the air thick with the smell of decay. But I was not alone. Figures huddled in the shadows, their faces gaunt and hollow. Their eyes, once filled with life, were now empty and dead. They were like me, survivors of the midnight feast, trapped in an eternal cycle of torment. But there was no escape. No release, for in Dracula's castle, death is not the dungeon was a graveyard of whispers. The voices of the dead and the dying swirled around me like a morbid wind, carrying with them the weight of eternity. I lay on the cold, damp stone, the remnants of my body shaking with the realization that I had not died, that I could not die. My joints screamed in agony, though the pain had receded to a dull roar. The bones that had been wrenched apart in the rack were now whole again, but the horror of my suffering remained branded on my soul. I was alive. And I was trapped. The air in the dungeon was suffocating, thick with the stench of rot and despair. There were others here, prisoners of the midnight feast, their eyes sunken, their skin hanging loosely from their bones as though their souls had been sucked dry. They didn't speak. They barely moved. They were beyond hope, reduced to empty shells that lingered in the Count's shadow, waiting for the next round of torment. I wanted to scream at them, to demand answers, but my voice was little more than a hoarse whisper, lost in the gloom. I staggered to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me, and stumbled toward the barred door of my cell. The iron bars were slick with rust, and through them, I could see the shadowed hall beyond. Torches flickered along the walls, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent glee. Every now and then, a figure moved through the hall, one of the Count's creatures, no doubt. Their movements were slow and deliberate, as if they knew there was no need to rush. Time had no meaning here. I pressed my hands against the bars, my breath shallow and ragged. How long had I been down here? Minutes? Hours? Days? The dungeon seemed to exist outside of time, a place where suffering was eternal, and escape was nothing but a distant memory. My mind raced, trying to piece together a way out, but it felt like I was sinking in quicksand. The more I struggled, the deeper I sank into the madness. Then, from the far end of the hall, I heard the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing off the stone walls like a death march. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, as the figure approached. A tall, gaunt man with sunken cheeks and hollow eyes, dressed in the ragged remnants of what once might have been fine clothing. His skin was pale, almost translucent, as though he hadn't seen the sun in centuries. He stopped in front of my cell, his eyes fixed on me with a hollow, predatory gaze. "You've been chosen," he rasped, his voice as dry as the bones that littered the dungeon floor. The Count desires your presence." My stomach twisted into a knot of terror. I had no idea what the Count had planned for me. But I knew it would be worse than anything I had endured so far. The man fumbled with a large iron key, unlocking the door to my cell with a loud, grating sound that sent shivers down my spine. The door swung open with a creak, and I stepped forward on legs that felt like jelly. I wanted to refuse, to resist, but there was no point. The Count had claimed me from the moment I had set foot in his cursed castle. I was his, body and soul. The man led me through the winding corridors of the dungeon, past the cells where other prisoners languished in their torment. Some reached out to me with skeletal hands, their fingers brushing my skin like the touch of the dead. Their faces were gaunt. Their eyes filled with a pleading that I could not answer. I kept my gaze forward, afraid that if I looked too closely at them, I would see my own fate reflected in their hollow stares. We ascended a narrow stone staircase, the air growing colder with every step. The walls were lined with faded tapestries, once grand but now stained with the passage of time and the blood of countless victims. The Count's castle was alive with the suffering of the damned, and I could feel the weight of their torment pressing down. When we reached the top of the stairs, we emerged into a grand hallway lined with tall, arched windows. Outside, the night was thick with fog, the moon barely visible through the mist. The air was still, suffocating in its silence, and the only sound was the faint whisper of the wind against the glass. The man stopped in front of a massive set of double doors, their surface carved with intricate designs of serpents and skulls. He turned to me, his hollow eyes meeting mine with a look of grim finality. "Enter," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "And prepare yourself for what is to come." With trembling hands, I pushed open the doors and stepped into the room beyond. The chamber was vast, its ceiling disappearing into shadow. A single chandelier hung from above, casting a sickly yellow light over the scene before me. The walls were lined with blood-stained velvet drapes, and at the far end of the room, seated on a throne of blackened iron, was the Count. He watched me with those same burning eyes, his lips curled into a smile that was both inviting and terrifying. His body was draped in a robe of crimson, the fabric shimmering in the dim light like the surface of a pool of blood. He radiated power, and even from across the room, I could feel the pull of his presence, like a black hole drawing me in. Beside him, a long banquet table stretched across the room. Covered in silver platters overflowing with grotesque delicacies, severed limbs, roasted flesh, and goblets filled to the brim with dark, viscous blood. Around the table, the guests from the ball sat in their places, though they were no longer the elegant figures I had seen earlier. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their eyes sunken, their once fine clothing now torn and stained with blood. They stared ahead with blank, lifeless expressions, as though they were puppets waiting for their. At the center of the table lay the body of a young woman, her skin pale and bruised, her throat slit wide open. Blood pooled around her, dripping onto the floor in a steady rhythm. Her lifeless eyes stared up at the ceiling, frozen in an expression of terror. I felt bile rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down, forcing myself to keep my composure. This was the midnight feast, and I was its next course. The Count rose from his throne, his movements fluid and graceful, as though he was gliding across the floor rather than walking. He approached me with that same predatory smile, his eyes never leaving mine. "You have survived longer than most," he said, his voice low and smooth. "It is a testament to your spirit. But now, you must offer something more." He reached out and placed a cold hand on my chest, his fingers curling around the fabric of my dress. I could feel his touch seeping into my skin, a coldness that pierced through to my very bones. "I will grant you the gift of eternity," he whispered, his breath cold against my neck. "But first, you must endure the final trial." With a swift motion, he tore the dress from my body, leaving me exposed and vulnerable before him. I shivered, not just from the cold, but from the weight of his gaze. His eyes roamed over my flesh, drinking in every inch of me as though he was savoring the anticipation of what was to come. He gestured toward the banquet table, where the body of the young woman still lay, her blood pooling beneath her. "Lie down," he commanded, his voice like a blade slicing through the air. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. But I knew there was no escape. I was his, and I had been from the moment I had stepped through the castle gates. With trembling legs, I walked toward the table and climbed onto it, lying down beside the lifeless body of the woman. The cold blood seeped into my skin, staining my flesh as I stared up at the ceiling, his eyes gleaming with a hunger that went beyond the physical. He leaned down, his lips brushing against my ear as he whispered the words that sealed my fate, "You will become one with the feast." And then, the pain began, his fangs sank into my neck, and I felt the familiar burn of his bite, but this time, it was different. This time, the pain was more intense, more consuming. It spread through my body like wildfire, igniting every nerve with searing agony. My vision blurred, and my body convulsed on the table, but there was no release, no escape from the torment. I could feel my blood being drained from me, my life slipping away with every passing second. But just when I thought I could bear no more, the Count pulled back, his mouth dripping with my blood. He smiled down at me, his eyes filled with a sadistic joy. "You are ready." And with that, the real torture began. The creatures emerged from the shadows once more, their eyes gleaming with hunger as they descended upon me. Their claws tore into my flesh, peeling it away piece by piece, until I was nothing but a raw, bleeding mass of pain. My screams echoed through the chamber, but they only seemed to fuel their frenzy. They feasted on my agony, reveling in the destruction of my body. The Count watched from his throne, his eyes never leaving me. The creatures' claws dug deeper, ripping into my flesh, their hunger insatiable. I screamed, my voice hoarse and broken from hours of torment. Every nerve in my body was ablaze with pain, but I was still conscious, still alive in this endless nightmare. Their teeth gnawed on my limbs, tearing muscle from bone, yet the venom in my veins kept me from the mercy of death. The Count had ensured that I would feel every moment of my agony, and he watched with eyes full of twisted pleasure, his throne looming in the background like a dark. The Count loomed over me, his eyes gleaming with a hunger that went beyond the physical. He leaned down, his lips brushing against my ear as he whispered the words that sealed my fate, "You will become one with the feast." And then, the pain began, his fangs sank into my neck, and I felt the familiar burn of his bite, but this time, it was different. This time, the pain was more intense, more consuming. It spread through my body like wildfire, igniting every nerve with searing agony. My vision blurred, and my body convulsed on the table, but there was no release, no escape from the torment. I could feel my blood being drained from me, my life slipping away with every passing second. But just when I thought I could bear no more, the Count pulled back, his mouth dripping with my blood. He smiled down at me, his eyes filled with a sadistic joy. "You are ready." And with that, the real torture began. The creatures emerged from the shadows once more, their eyes gleaming with hunger as they descended upon me. Their claws tore into my flesh, peeling it away piece by piece, until I was nothing but a raw, bleeding mass of pain. My screams echoed through the chamber, but they only seemed to fuel their frenzy. They feasted on my agony, reveling in the destruction of my body. The Count watched from his throne, his eyes never leaving me. The creatures' claws dug deeper, ripping into my flesh, their hunger insatiable. I screamed, my voice hoarse and broken from hours of torment. Every nerve in my body was ablaze with pain, but I was still conscious, still alive in this endless nightmare. Their teeth gnawed on my limbs, tearing muscle from bone, yet the venom in my veins kept me from the mercy of death. The Count had ensured that I would feel every moment of my agony, and he watched with eyes full of twisted pleasure, his throne looming in the background like a dark god. I lay sprawled on the table, half of my body reduced to a grotesque mess of torn flesh and exposed bone. The creatures tore at me, their wet, slurping noises the only sound in the chamber other than my ragged breathing. I could feel their hot breath on my skin as they feasted, their movements frantic, savage. Blood pooled beneath me, sticky and thick, and I could feel it congealing under my back, gluing me to the cold surface of the table. The taste of iron filled my mouth. My vision blurred, but my senses, cursed by whatever dark magic held me together, remained agonizingly sharp. Every moment stretched into eternity. I wanted to die, to slip into the sweet abyss of nothingness. But death was not an option. The Count's venom ensured that my body would heal, only to be torn apart again. The cycle was endless. I managed to lift my head, and through the haze of pain, I saw the Count still seated on his throne, his eyes glowing in the dim light of the torches. His pale lips curled into a satisfied smile as he watched my torment unfold. He was in no rush. I was his entertainment, his masterpiece of suffering. Do you feel it yet? His voice slithered into my mind, smooth as silk. The gift of immortality, wrapped in pain. You are becoming something more, something beyond human. His words echoed through my skull, and I realized with a sickening lurch that he wasn't lying. My body, though mangled and broken, was beginning to heal. Slowly, agonizingly, the flesh that had been torn from my bones started to regenerate. I could feel the skin stitching itself back together, the pain of regeneration almost as excruciating as the initial damage. Every nerve screamed as tendons reattached, as blood vessels reknitted themselves. My body was rebuilding itself so that the creatures could tear it apart again. I screamed, thrashing against the chains that bound me to the table, but the chains were cold and unyielding, biting into my wrists and ankles, holding me in place for the feast. The creatures only seemed more excited by my struggles, their grotesque faces leering at me as they continued their work. I felt a sharp stab in my chest as one of them sank its claws into my ribcage, prying it open with a sickening crack. Blood spurted from the wound, splashing against the creature's face, but it only grinned wider, its teeth slick with gore. I could feel its breath, warm and rancid, against my exposed organs as it bent down, gnawing at my insides. Tears streamed down my face, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The pain was unbearable, yet I could not die. The Count's venom ensured that I remained alive. Even as my body was torn apart piece by piece. I was trapped in this eternal cycle of death and rebirth, a living corpse, bound to the Count's twisted whims. I begged for the release of death, but my pleas were swallowed by the darkness. There was no escape from this torment, no end to the suffering, and then, through the fog of pain, I felt something shift. A presence, cold and ancient, crept into the room like a shadow. The creatures paused, their heads snapping toward the door as if sensing something far older, far more powerful than the Count himself. The air grew colder, the very walls of the chamber trembling as the door creaked open. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. Tall and cloaked in darkness. I could feel its gaze on me, burning into my soul. The creatures recoiled, hissing in fear, retreating into the shadows as the figure entered the room. The Count's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing in suspicion as he rose from his throne. Who dares to intrude upon my feast? He snarled, his voice cold and sharp. The figure stepped forward, and as the dim light from the torches flickered across its face, I felt my heart stop. It was a woman, her skin pale as the moon, her eyes burning. She moved with the grace of a predator, her long, black hair flowing like a shadow behind her. There was something ancient about her, something far more terrifying than the Count himself. Dracula, the Count whispered, his voice trembling ever so slightly, though his face remained impassive. I thought you were lost to the ages. The woman smiled, her lips curling in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. You forget your place, Count, she said, her voice smooth and cold, like the blade of a knife. I am eternal. You are but a shadow of my legacy. The Count stepped back, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. I have earned my place in your domain, he hissed, though there was an edge of fear in his voice. This castle is mine. These souls are mine. Dracula's smile widened, revealing sharp fangs that glistened in the dim light. You have grown arrogant in your solitude, she said softly, taking a step closer to him. But you forget, you belong to me. The Count's face twisted with fury, but before he could move, Dracula was upon him. She moved with inhuman speed, her hands wrapping around his throat as she lifted him from the ground with ease. The Count's eyes bulged, his mouth opening in a silent scream as Dracula tightened her grip, her nails digging into his flesh. You are nothing without me, she hissed, her voice filled with centuries of wrath. You will suffer as you have made them suffer. With a brutal motion, she snapped the Count's neck, the sound echoing through the chamber like the crack of thunder. His body crumpled to the ground, lifeless and broken, and the creatures that had once served him fled into the shadows, their hunger forgotten in the face of her power. Dracula turned to me, her burning eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I thought she might leave me to my fate, but instead, she stepped forward, her hand reaching out to brush against my cheek. Her touch was cold the way she looked at me. You are not like the others, she murmured, her voice low. You have suffered, but you have not broken. I stared up at her, unable to speak, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. I didn't know what she wanted from me, but I knew better than to resist. Dracula leaned down, her lips brushing against my ear as she whispered, You will be my companion in eternity. But first, you must be reborn. Before I could react, she sank her fangs into my throat. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a fire that seared through my veins, but unlike the Count's bite, this was different. It wasn't just agony, it was power. I could feel something dark and ancient flooding into me, filling the cracks in my soul left by the torture I had endured. My body convulsed as the venom took hold, burning away the last remnants of my humanity. Dracula pulled back, her eyes glowing with satisfaction as she watched the transformation take place. I could feel it too, the coldness spreading through me, reshaping me, remaking me into something more than human. The pain faded, replaced by a strange numbness, and when I opened my eyes, the world looked different. Sharper. Darker. I could hear every creak of the castle, every heartbeat of the remaining souls in the dungeon below. My senses were heightened, my body stronger, faster. I had become one of them. Dracula smiled down at me, her fangs glistening in the dim light. Welcome to eternity, she said softly. You are mine now. I stood, my body no longer trembling, the pain gone. I could feel the power coursing through me, the hunger gnawing at my insides. I was no longer a victim, I was a predator, but as I gazed into Dracula's eyes, I realized that my nightmare was far from over. I had escaped one prison, only to be bound to another. Eternity stretched before me, dark and endless, and the hunger never stopped.